prevalence of autism. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our new results, which came out in December, and they are the results of our 2018 study year. So let's go ahead and get started. These are the sites that were involved in this particular study year. And you can see we have a certain amount of variation between sites. And we'll come back to California and we'll talk about that a little bit at the end because that's worth mentioning. So in the 2016 publication, our estimate of autism prevalence was that ASD affected about 1 in every 54 children. In 2018, that's 1 in every 44 children. However, it's important to at least be thinking about the fact that we have changed our protocol. So we've changed the procedures that we are using to collect these data. And so I want to talk about the effects of that. So this is going to be a slide where I'm going to walk you through our original protocol, the classic ADAM. I call it ADAM Classic and then New ADAM. So in the ADAM Classic protocol, a child would get a record, would have a record that gains them case status, you know, as a case for this monitoring network. And it all starts with a parent, caregiver, physician, or another adult who recognizes that this child could potentially benefit from an evaluation. That's the first thing that has to happen. Next, that evaluation actually does have to take place, which it may or may not for various reasons. Once the evaluation is taking place, it has to be conducted by an evaluator who recognizes the ASD-related behaviors as being potentially indicative of ASD. And once they recognize those behaviors, then they need to document them in the record. Because actually, until those behaviors were documented in the record, everything that happens before this is invisible to our system. So our system in the original ADAM protocol could only pick up children that have these behaviors documented in the record. We did not require that the children be having a clinical diagnosis or be in special education for autism, just that they have these behaviors documented in the record. And then we would collect the information, put it all together on each child from all the different places where we saw them, and then we would form our own opinion about whether the child met our case definition. And we collected personal identifiers, so we were able to match all the information on Johnny from all the schools that we saw where he had records and all the clinics that we saw him in where they had records. So we were able to put together all the information from the different sources. And so I originally put this slide together to talk about how increases in awareness of the condition could lead to the appearance of an increase in prevalence, even if there weren't. I'm not saying there is no increase in prevalence. I'm saying even if there isn't, if the prevalence is remaining the same, but we have additional parents and caregivers recognizing that the child needs an evaluation and getting them started through the process, then that can cause it to look like there's an increasing prevalence. Then we need the evaluator to be able to recognize these behaviors. And if evaluators are becoming more aware of autism-related behaviors over time and are better able to recognize them, then that can contribute to this appearance of an increase, even if there weren't one. But, you know, I'm not saying there's not, but it is possible to increase the apparent prevalence without having the prevalence change at all. And so that's been, all along, that's been a little bit of our quandary, trying to tease out what might be a real increase from increases that just simply derive from these other kinds of awareness factors and improvements in record keeping, for example. At this point, though, in the Adam Classic protocol, we did not require that the children have a clinical diagnosis of autism or special ed eligibility for autism, only that we could find them in the records, and then they would have to have these behaviors documented there. And that is one of the main differences in our new protocol, is that when we moved to the new protocol for the 2018 year, which is the new numbers that have come out, are the first ones under the new protocol. It did require that they have either a clinical diagnosis, a special ed exceptionality of autism, or both. Okay, so so when I first heard about that, I was really concerned about what this new protocol would mean for the prevalence that we're publishing. And so I started looking at a variable that we've had all along, but I started really looking at it in depth for the first time when we changed our protocol. And I call it community recognition, because that's a little more friendly than AUDX3CAT, right? So community recognition, the first level is the child does in fact have an ASD and or a special education exceptionality of autism. Level 2 would be someone in the record somewhere said that they suspected that the child could have autism. And level 3 was possible in the old protocol, but is no longer possible in the new protocol, which is to have children that we agree are cases that have absolutely no mention of autism in their records at all. Okay. And, you know, if you think about it, that's kind of shocking, really, because for them to gain case status as autism cases for our system, we have to be able to find within their records all of the types of behaviors that would be required to be diagnosed. And so it's a little amazing that all of the behaviors are there in the records and then not have anyone really say the word autism at all. So we started this whole effort in the study year 2000. And in that first study year, we had a little over half of our cases. These are children that had all of those behaviors documented in their record to be considered autism cases. And about half of them, a little over half, either had a diagnosis and or a special ed exceptionality. A little less than 10% had a suspicion of autism mentioned, and about 37% had no mention of ASD whatsoever in their records. So this was really a source of a lot of concern for me, because I really thought that we would be missing out on a lot of kids by moving to the new protocol. But when I started looking at additional years, this is what I found. This is kind of, I'll go into a little more detail in the next graph, but you can see by 2014, about 85% of the children that we recognized as cases already had a clinical diagnosis or a special ed exceptionality or both. The suspicion category stayed, it's fluctuated somewhat, but it's more or less around 10% or less. But you can see the no mention category is really where we had a lot of change. We went from 37% of kids in the first year to about 6% in 2014. And this was when I started to feel a little more relieved about the changes that were being made to the protocol. And this is a graph that includes all the years up through 2014. The percent of cases that we recognized that had no mention of autism in their records. And you can see it's really come down. I have other graphs where I look at the other sites. We started the highest, and so partly because of that, it's our drop-off that is most dramatic across the system. In general, though, all of the different sites, most of them have this kind of downward trend in the proportion that had no mention of autism. So this got me started thinking about the different ways we could proceed with trying to come up with these estimates. And so I put together this graphic. The clinical evaluation has some things going for it, but it has some things that are a knock against it as well. To sample a population of children and bring some of them in for evaluation would be the most expensive way to proceed. And it would also be extraordinarily time consuming because those evaluations are not trivial to do. And because it would be more expensive and time consuming, that would mean that we would have to be satisfied with a much smaller population. We would not be able to, for example, include all of Maricopa County. We would collect the greatest number of details about the child and their history and their symptoms, and the accuracy of diagnosis would be the best that it could possibly be. So we would be extremely confident about a very small group of children. And so the classic protocol is moving, toward the right on this, and it does cost a little bit less than bringing everyone in for an evaluation. It takes a little bit less time. And therefore, because of those, we can include a somewhat larger population. The details we collected were still very good. We collected word-for-word descriptions of children's behaviors, and those are what formed the basis of our decision about whether or not they met the case definition. And so we were pretty happy with the accuracy of our diagnosis. Maybe not quite as good as clinical evaluation, but pretty good, and the best we could do to cover a larger population. Our new protocol, which is where we are now, again, it costs a little bit less. Hopefully the time to completion is also going to decrease, which opens up the possibility of including a larger population, although the details are not as good. We are no longer collecting those detailed descriptions of children's behaviors. So we were working with a person who is doing, she does evaluation of text data, and we were working with her, and we're not really able to supply that kind of detailed text to her anymore. So, so that's one of the downsides. And we're only going to be capturing children that are previously recognized in some way, either the clinical diagnosis or special education. And then this last one on the far edge is a supplemental protocol that we started working on. We applied for it in August of 2020. And so we've been working on it since then. And this is a protocol that does not involve any kind of record review. That makes it much cheaper and faster. And this is going to be what an epidemiologist calls an administrative prevalence. So we're going to be looking at clinical sources and school sources, and we're just getting the information about the kids put together so we can get a count of children that are recognized. The details won't be there. We won't have really very much information at all beyond county of residence and basic demographic characteristics. And of course, you know, how accurate is the diagnosis? It depends on how good the clinicians are in the area and how good the teachers are. And so, but we are going to be covering the entire state of Arizona. So for those of you who've been asking me for years and years about what's going on in Pima County, I may now be able to have something to say about that. Okay. And one of the motivations for the change in protocol is really to respond to criticism of the system about how long it takes. 2018 was a while ago, and we are only, you know, just publishing the results of the 2018 data in December of 2021. So I put together this graph, and we have gotten faster somewhat. This 6.1 years, that is just a reflection of how long it takes to set up something like this. And when new sites come in, it tends to be a long time before they can really get up and running. I expect that our 2020 data, we're hoping will come out in somewhat less than 2.8 years. You know, but there's been a few little complications along the way for the 18 data and the 2020 data, like, you know, COVID, which is something we're having to deal with as well. But hopefully we will be able to be getting our estimates out more in a more timely way from now on. Also, the other thing that got me, that I got thinking about during the transition to the new protocol was all the various different phases that we've been through as a group, as a surveillance group. And when I started thinking about it, most people think only about the number of cases, and they don't really think too much about how we calculate the prevalence, which also requires us to know, well, how many kids are there? And so, of course, how many kids are there is information that we take from the census data. And so the census, which only happens once every 10 years, then will provide estimates going forward. And those estimates can, you know, sometimes get quite varied from what's really going on, which we only know about when we do another census. So we've used 3 sets of census data, the 2000, 2010, and now the 2020. And then we had the classic protocol, which we've now changed over to the new one. And we've added the supplement. And of course, we started out using the DSM-4 criteria. And in phase 3, we actually had 2 study years where we used both the DSM-4 criteria, and the DSM-5, so that we could get a comparison of how that change in DSM would affect our prevalence. And interestingly enough, it doesn't seem to affect it a lot. The children are not all exactly the same, but the prevalence is pretty similar overall, because there are some children that qualify for DSM-4, but not under the DSM-5. And there's also kids that qualify under the DSM-5 that didn't qualify under the DSM-4. And so that actually turns out to be a bit of a wash. So when I got started thinking about that, I realized, well, we've had a lot of potential for changes that are not really based on changes in actual prevalence, but in fact are changes that are related to these other kinds of things, where we're getting our census data, what criteria we're using, and our protocol. So I decided to make a graph. This is not really statistical. It's more me looking to see whether I think that there's something dramatic going on as a result of those changes. And I don't really feel like I'm seeing anything that makes me go, wait a minute, I need to really check into this. So the red line with the yellow suns here is Arizona, and the other line is the overall for the whole system. And we have been in the system since its inception in 2000. We've been in for every year. That's another thing to keep in mind, though. The set of states that have contributed data is different. It's variable. I'm not sure we may have 2 study years in a row with exactly the same states, but it doesn't happen that often. So these are the differences. Now, I know I've heard people asking me about this huge jump between our 2016 estimate and our 2018 estimate. And, we can maybe talk about this a little more, but I see that as more about, my question is more about what happened in 2010 through 16, not what happened between 16 and 18. Because if you look at it, we were pretty consistently above everyone else in phase 1. In phase 2 and 3, we sort of got in line with everyone and then sagged below. And now with the new protocol, we've jumped up again. So I think it's more interesting to say, why are these numbers so low, rather than why is this one so high? And if you look at what's happening in the other states, I think that's more consistent. Rather than this being a spike up in 18, it looks like suppression of some sort in our numbers, our estimates from the earlier years, the 14, 16 years. And we can talk about that later if we have time. So I wanted to look at the prevalence changes across this shift in methodologies, because everyone was concerned, as was I, that by leaving out children that don't have an official recognition already, a diagnosis or an exceptionality, that we would be losing kids. And we worried that our prevalence would go down just from that. And that did not happen at all. So here we are in Arizona, and our prevalence from 16 to 18 was the largest increase. And only New Jersey went down. So all the other sites went up. So that kind of makes us feel a little better about the change in protocol. Then another question that we had about this change in protocol was whether it would disproportionately affect communities that have disparities in access to healthcare, right? Whether minority kids would be more likely to be left out. And so to address that, I looked at the white to Hispanic and the white to Black ratios of cases for 16 and 18 for each of these study sites. And if I've got more disparities, this number is going to go up. And if I've got less disparities, it's going to go down. So what we see is, for example, in Arizona, the white to Hispanic ratio went down. So we are not leaving out disproportionately more Hispanic children than white children. In fact, the prevalence is getting closer and closer. In the 2000 study year, this was about 3.8 to 1. And while the prevalence in both of these communities has increased, the prevalence in the Hispanic community, it has increased faster. And so that gap has been narrowing. And we see it's continuing to narrow here, even despite the shift in methodology. I don't usually talk too much about Arizona specific numbers for the white versus the Black communities because, you know, the numbers are actually a little small. I think that's probably what happened in Georgia. This is the only one of these ratios that increased from 2016 to 18. And that was in the Georgia white to Hispanic ratio. And that may be partly from smaller numbers. And then in Missouri, they didn't even have enough to do the comparison for the 2018 study year. So you can't talk about people who you didn't look at, right? If you don't have the population, then there's really nothing to say. So, but this graph is really the one that solidifies my endorsement of our new methodology. So here is the graph then of, and I wish I had, Bree, could you tell me what time it is?
Yes, it's 12:28.
Awesome. Okay, so in this graph, we can see these are the sites that were included in the 2018 study year. And you can see they've color-coded this with green children had an ASD diagnosis. Blue were in special ed with no diagnosis. So they had an exceptionality, but not a diagnosis. And in the purple, they had a clinical diagnosis only. So they were not also seen in schools. And you can see Arizona definitely has the very smallest purple section. And that's because clinical services for autism in Arizona are much less plentiful than in the other sites. And that's been true consistently over the years. Oh, actually, that was hang on a second. I keep getting the thing in the way. Actually, New Jersey then also had a very small proportion of their kids that were seen only in clinics and not at schools. So this is a good time, I think, to address the California question. What is going on in California? Look at this. They are the new kid on the block. This is our first publication that has been published that includes data from California. And they've just left us all in the dust. And even the people who are running the new study site in California were a little surprised. But once they started collecting data, they found out something they hadn't realized before, which their study area is mostly in San Diego. And San Diego, of course, includes a big naval facility. And what they didn't realize going into this was that if you're a service member in the Navy and you have a dependent that has a serious medical issue like autism, that cannot necessarily be treated well just anywhere, then they will send you to the base where your dependent can get treatment. And it happens to be that the only naval base with really good, strong services for children with autism is San Diego. And so service members that have children with autism are sent to San Diego, and they stop moving them. So there's that whole idea of service members moving around quite frequently. But once they end up in San Diego with a child with autism, then they stay there. And so my thought is that is why California looks so much higher than other sites, because the study site is really focused around San Diego, and that's where the kids are. All the military children with autism are there, or mostly all of them. So so you can see Arizona is, you know, a little above the line being the overall average. And you can see that we are not particularly good with clinical services, but we do have a lot of special ed and both. So they have either diagnosis, or they have a diagnosis, or they have an eligibility, but not necessarily a diagnosis. So these are the new numbers by prevalence by race and ethnic categories. And sorry, this is the one thing about, oh, there we go. Okay. And so you can see that actually we don't seem to be having all that much in the way of prevalence disparities for the 2018 data. The American Indian and Alaska Native numbers are higher, but there's also those huge error bars around this. And that is a reflection of the fact that this is a rather small community. And so when you have a smaller community, these error bands are bigger. So you can see that that the Hispanic and Black and Asian Pacific Islander populations all look pretty similar, and not that different from the white prevalence. And in fact, if these populations were being selectively left out, you would expect that they would have lower prevalence, and that really isn't what we've seen here. So, and again, these tiny little error bars on the white prevalence estimate is reflective of the fact that that's actually the biggest population we have. This is among 4-year-olds. This is the first time I've mentioned them in this talk. In 2010, Arizona joined the effort to also collect information on children at age 4. All of the previous slides I've talked about have been about our 8-year-olds. And in 2018, with the change to the new protocol, this is the first time that all sites have been collecting data on children who are age 4. And it's interesting to see the difference between what's going on here with the 4-year-olds compared to the 8-year-olds. So by 8, it looks like we have most of our groups are about equal, and that is a very different story here. And so it will be interesting to see, presuming if we're still collecting data on this in 4 years, we'll see these same children again at the age of 8. And it will be interesting to look at what has happened with this since. So this is kind of an interesting graph. I really like it. It's a little difficult to explain, I think, but we look at all the children, the 8-year-olds in our system, and we look for their first diagnosis or special education eligibility. And whatever age they were, when they got that, then that is when they're added into the graph. So at 1 year or 12 months, no one had that. And then we keep collecting them up. And then you can see by 48 months or 4 years, our 8-year-olds had a prevalence that was still less than 10 per 1,000. And this is the difference 4 years can make, because we see that among our 4-year-olds, by the time they got to their 4th birthday, the prevalence among the 4-year-olds was something like 14, right? 13 or 14. And so we see that the difference between these two lines is a difference in early recognition. So I see this as really good news. It means that a much higher proportion of our kiddos are getting recognized at younger ages. And so this is the system overall. And this is Arizona. And maybe we don't look quite as good as the overall, but there is that difference where the kids in the 4-year-old group seem to be getting recognized at earlier ages than the ones that are 4 years older. And actually, I said I could talk all day, but this is my last slide with the citations and the links to these articles. And, it's free to download them, of course, and because you paid for them, right? These are your publications because you're taxpayers who pay us to collect the data. And so because I am actually uncharacteristically finished, I will have time to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Pettygrove, for this information. If people have questions, you can pop them in the chat and we'll get them over to Dr. Pettygrove.
Well, I see that there are some things in the chat.
So yeah, comment on male versus female numbers.
Okay, hang on a second. I stopped screen sharing and that was not my intention. Yeah, so I didn't really emphasize that the prevalence ratios between males and females usually runs between like 3.5 and 5. I don't recall what the proportion is for this. And that's likely because it's in that same range. So it doesn't look like that has really changed much. So I don't think I have any graphs here on that.
Sydney, this is Kristen.
Yes, and Kristen, hang on a second. Kristen is the person who is responsible for the data collection in a huge way and really keeps me on track. And she'll let you know if I've said anything that's wrong.
No, nothing at all. I was just going to update on the male to female ratio for study year 2018. For our 8-year-olds, boys were 3.4 times as likely to be identified as girls. And for our 4-year-olds, boys were 4.7 times as likely as females.
That's interesting.
So 3.4 and 4.7.
Yeah, so 3.4 seems actually lower than it has been in the past. And it's interesting because, you know, we're still thinking about the whole change in protocol and what it means. And one person suggested that that actually it's an improvement for minority and underserved populations, of which in the autism community, I think girls really count, because it sort of removes that whole judgment of the clinician review process. So what we would do before is we would take all these descriptions of behaviors, put them together for each child from all the sources, and then we would have a person who had clinical experience and special training in this process would review the information and decide, does this child meet either the DSM-4 or the DSM-5 now criteria for autism? And by removing that process, we've actually removed any potential differences in the way evaluators talk about the kids based on their ethnicity or their gender or their, you know, their sex. That's kind of taken away a little bit, because if you're coming in with a diagnosis, then you're going to end up being a case. And so it's interesting to me that not only did we not see these disparities increase, but we also saw them that gender ratio decreased as well. And so I've always been wondering, to what extent is the male predominance in autism because that is how we originally thought about this condition, and that we are more accustomed to looking for these kinds of behaviors in boys, and it's easier to recognize maybe in boys. And perhaps the presentation among girls would be different. And so, you know, that's kind of interesting. So where does all the data come from? That's a great question. So what we do is we work with the school districts, and our entire study area is in Maricopa County, but it's not all the districts. So over time, our study area has shrunk because the population of Maricopa County has increased faster than the funding. So we have select school districts that form our study area, and we put in a data request for a listing of all the children who are in special education. And in the original protocol, well, actually, we still do review all their records. It's just that in the original protocol, we were doing this word for word capture, typing in the descriptions of their behaviors, and we're not doing that anymore. And so that's part of how it reduces the time and then the expense. So that's the school side. The other side is the clinical side. And so at the clinical side, we go in to the sources and we submit a data request. We have sharing agreements with them. And we would submit we still do a data request for any child in a certain birth year who had any of a huge list of ICD codes. And ICD is the International Classification of Diseases. In the US, we use them as billing codes. And we look for any child that has any one of these codes that have any kind of overlap in symptomology with autism. So ADHD and speech language impairment. Some sites didn't find that they found cases there, but we do. So all the variety of different ICD codes. So we had been casting a very broad net. And these days, of course, that is reduced a bit since we don't consider anyone that doesn't already have a recognition. Okay. Yeah, I would love to chat with you about my hypothesis about the naval connection. That was not something that was on their radar screen when they proposed to do this work in that area. And it was only after they started collecting data that they realized, wow, okay, that's something to think about.
Dr. Pettygrove, I have a question in regards to you mentioning that you would have more information on Pima County and Arizona as a whole versus just Maricopa. Do you know
Yes.
when that's coming or when?
We're working on it. We've submitted our data. So
Okay.
this was supplemental funding that we had gotten during the pandemic. And theoretically, we were supposed to have all of our data collected by the end of 2020. Was that, no, 20, no, that was that 2020 or was it 2021?
It was supposed to be, but that's not how it worked out for any site.
Right. And there, in fact, we have submitted our data, but there are a couple of sites that haven't yet. So, so that's going to be coming. We hope it's going to be coming soon. And that will be, prevalence by county in Arizona.
Wow.
And that's going to be great because
that's going to be great.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
And then, but see, the really brilliant thing about that is because we have much more detailed data in Maricopa County, then we can compare the two different methods. And we could say, how does it look when we use the supplemental method to, how does that compare with what we see there from the more detailed ATOM methodology? And so that will give us an idea of how good those estimates could be or where they might be off. And so then we'll be able to present that as well. And I will contact you when we have
I'll set it up. That'd be great.
Presentation, and I'll come tell you all about it.
Yeah,
So.
that'd be great. Does anyone have any other questions? You can post it in the chat. How did you decide which districts with whom to work with in Pima County?
Well, okay. In Pima County, we're not working with specific districts. So Pima County is going to be included in the supplemental, and that is at the state level. And we're not looking through records. It's data scraping. We're scraping all that educational data. We're scraping clinical data, and we're putting it all together. And so it should cover all of Pima County. For my colleagues that originally proposed to do this work wanted to do both Pima County and Maricopa County. Wow, that would be a lot. And when around the time I came on the project, we were kind of grappling with the fact that that wasn't going to be possible. Just the effort involved in doing all the data collection, it was just crazy. But unfortunately for us, the Pima County population wasn't big enough. We wouldn't qualify for funding based on the size of the population that was going to be required. And so we decided that we would just work in Maricopa. So that's a little awkward. It took a while before we really figured out how to make that situation work. And fortunately, we have Kristen and her predecessor, Jen. We've had only 2 project coordinators over this entire time since the year 2000. And that's pretty awesome. And that's partly because Kristen's been with us for 17 years. And that really makes a big difference in how smoothly things run, I think. In Maricopa County, we started saying we want the whole county. And as the population was growing and, we started to realize how difficult it was to get out to the outlying districts. So we started shrinking the study area, and more in on Phoenix, and that area. And then it also just depends on the school district's willingness to work with us. So we have an agreement in place with the State Department of Education that is permissive. It permits school districts to work with us if they choose to. And I have to say that school districts that have continued to work with us all these years are just the bee's knees. You know, they don't have to do this at all. They don't have to. Well, of course, we try and keep a light footprint on them. We come around about once every other year, and we try and get in there and collect the data and get out. But you know, it's extra people coming into the district office and finding a place for us to work. And you know, frankly, special education directors are usually up to here all the time. So we really appreciate the ones that have continued to work with us. And, you know, we're always really sad when districts we've worked with in the past decide they just can't manage. And with COVID, we happen to just be lucky because we had done most of our data collection at data sources that don't have electronic records. And then we had, it just happened, we had finished most of those before the pandemic started. And so since then, we've been able to set up secure ways of reviewing records without having to go there, so remotely. And so our abstraction team has mostly been working from their homes all through this time. And it's just, you know, it's just lucky that we just happen to have already finished the places that couldn't set something like that up with us. And then, of course, that was the study year 18, but study year 2020, now we're starting with the places that can do remote access. And we just keep hoping that it's going to look reasonably safe to send our team back out to the district offices in time to collect the data to finish the 2020 study year. And, you know, so I just keep watching the map of, the CDC has a map of transmission, and that, you know, that map includes 3,220 counties. And last time I looked, all of them had high transmission except 5. Out of 3,220, 5 had less than high transmission. So I'd rather not send people out into the district until that's changed, but I just, you know, crossing my fingers here.
Well, thank you and your team for this incredible, crucial, vital work. And I use this every single day. I think of you every single time I look at that map. So thank you so much for this incredible insight and your behind the scenes look and sharing that with us. We really appreciate you. And we'll bring you back again so you could talk about Pima County and the whole state of Arizona. So thank you so very much.
Yeah, I'm very excited.
We are too. We are too. And we'll follow you along the way. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you everybody for being here as well. Thank you.